Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, IDF soldiers closing in on the suspected terrorists who shot up a bus station at the Tapuach Junction on Sunday. Meanwhile, President Rivlin likely to have his hands full as Prime Minister Netanyahu's mandate to form a government comes to a close. And finally, a historic first in the world of Israeli sports. Stay tuned for the details. Israeli Defense Forces closing in on the suspected terrorist responsible for the Sunday evening drive-by shooting at the Tapuach Junction in the West Bank. After greatly increasing the number of soldiers in the area as part of the widespread manhunt for the shooter or shooters, Defense Forces arresting several suspects thought to be connected to the attack that left 3 Israeli students wounded, 2 of whom remain in critical condition. Additionally, as the searches continue with Palestinian Authority cooperation, Palestinian security forces successfully located the bullet-ridden van used in the attack just outside the village of Aqaba. Israeli media reporting that the prime suspect is a Hamas member who lives in the village but who is yet to be found. Israeli investigations set back by Palestinian residents in the area, however, who clashed with soldiers near the van and managed to set the car on fire before it was confiscated as evidence. Meanwhile, complicating the situation further, clashes between Israeli settlers from Shiloh and nearby Palestinians seemingly popping up as a retaliation for the shooting. Though when IDF soldiers arrived to intervene and despite the Israelis slashing soldiers' tires, the IDF only reportedly fired rubber bullets at the Palestinians at the scene. Then finally, all this while, for the first time in months, 2 new balloons carrying explosive devices landed in southern Israel launched from Gaza. And residents reported seeing additional balloons overhead that afternoon, though it's not clear where they landed. Now, speaking of security, Israeli security officials arriving in the United States for high-level talks about Iran. Mossad Chief Yossi Cohen among the delegates, reiterating to United States President Biden that returning to the JCPOA nuclear deal would be nothing short of a mistake, unless the deal were drastically improved. Biden, meanwhile, saying that Washington is not too close to returning to the deal just yet, but is already considering huge rollbacks of some of the Trump-era sanctions imposed on Tehran as an incentive to get closer. Sanctions like those tied to terrorism, missile development, human rights abuses, and even their nuclear program. And joining me now with more is political analyst, American foreign policy expert, and professor at the State University of New York Maritime College, Mark Meirowitz. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you back. Thank you so much. So is the Biden administration close to negotiating a deal or not? We've been hearing many conflicting reports.
Well, I wasn't a fly in the room and I didn't hear the discussion, but as I understand it, Yossi Cohen was discussing issues with Jake Sullivan and our national security advisor, and President Biden stopped by to give his condolences on Iran and then talked about this issue. So it wasn't a set-up meeting with the president. Here's the thing. Biden has said he wants to do this deal. And we've seen in the first 100 days that when Biden says he wants to do something, he actually goes ahead and does it. The only thing is, America is a divided government in terms of separation of powers and checks and balances. So you hear different messages from different parts of the government. The Director of National Intelligence just issued a threat assessment listing the biggest threats in the world from China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Okay. At the Congress, when you have these hearings on Iran, you hear a lot of worry on the part of the Congress. Yet, if he wants to replicate what happened the last time, which is what he's doing, Biden is going to push forward with this deal. Now, we see that a little bit already because, we even see the way it's being negotiated is not to the benefit of the United States. The United States sits in a separate room. The other negotiators are sitting with Iran, China, Russia, the Europeans. The Chinese are the spokespersons. Can you imagine? The Americans are not even directly in the room. So we're already at a disadvantage here.
So do you think,
Iranians have said,
Well, I'm sorry. So do you think that the Biden administration's approach to Iran is worse than Obama's and Trump's, or how does it compare?
Right. So, I mean, Obama's approach, I think, was flawed because there was no verification. The deal sundowns, it ends after a certain number of years. And the biggest point was there were areas like the military bases which were off limits. And as you said earlier, what about these points about terrorism, ballistic missiles, and all the involvement of Iran in Yemen and all of these things, though these don't seem to be in the mix. So it's not as flawed as Obama. Trump's approach, you asked, was very, very strong. Perhaps some feel in retrospect was too strong, but it was strong and put us in a position now where the Iranians are going to sit down and negotiate, right? But all the incentives to negotiate are gone because the United States has already indicated it wants to do the deal. And it has even put the same people in place to negotiate it, like Wendy Sherman, who negotiated the Obama deal. So, you know, as they say in French, maybe there's an Israeli expression, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. As things change, they're just the same again. We're doing the same mistaken deal. The only difference is Israel's approach, I think, is much better by having quiet discussions about it rather than having a prime minister go to the Congress about it. The President Obama at that time didn't like that.
So, Mark, is that the key to success, you know, or rather, what is the key to success in trying to end Tehran's nuclear breakout once and for all?
So, if I knew the answer to that, I would be obviously quite a prophet, perhaps. So, the answer is the strength is the thing that the Iranians respect. The sanctions were very effective. They brought us actually to the point where we are. And now what we're doing is we're stepping back and not using the advantage of those sanctions. In fact, we're kind of doing a reverse game here. Iran has said, oh, you must release the sanctions before I'm going to do a deal with you. That is backwards. Backwards. The way to do the deal is to say, we're going to increase the sanctions. We're going to continue to do what we're doing. But Biden wants to make the deal. As we said before, despite the fact that there's divided opinions in our government about this issue and about the risk to the United States of a nuclear Iran, Biden is moving ahead full steam, despite the reports that we heard from the meeting.
All right, Mark Mirowitz, thank you so much again for meeting with us.
My pleasure.
Moving on, Prime Minister Netanyahu's deadline to form a coalition tonight at midnight. And Netanyahu is pulling out all the stops to make some magic happen. The Prime Minister issuing this last-ditch plea overnight.
אזרחי ישראל, אסור שדווקא בימים אלה ניכנע לשנאת חינם. אסור שהחרמות אישיות בתוך הימין ימנעו הקמת ממשלת ימין. אסור שנחזור על אסון אוסלו ונקים ממשלת שמאל עם עלה תאנה ימני חסר משמעות. ממשלה כזאת תהיה חלשה, מסוכסכת, מפולגת, משותקת.
Netanyahu then going on to detail why a left-wing government would be a mistake, while calling on Naftali Bennett from the Yamina party to join him in a coalition. His rationale being that if Bennett joins, others in the right will follow suit.
ולכן אני קורא לנפתלי בנט לחתום עוד היום על הסכם להקמת ממשלת ימין עם רוטציה של שנה אחת בראשותו ולהתחייב שלא יצטרף לשום ממשלה אחרת. בפוסט שהוא פרסם לפני 10 ימים, בנט כתב שאפשר להקים ממשלת ימין אם רק אזוז הצידה לשנה הראשונה. עזזתי. נפתלי, עכשיו תורך.
Still, Bennett essentially rejecting the offer out of hand on the grounds that the numbers just aren't there. Even if Bennett's Yamina were to join, the right-wing bloc would still be 2 seats short of a coalition. Additionally, it's assumed that Bennett is preferring to leave his options open for either a potential partnership with center-left opposition leader Yair Lapid, or even to get the mandate to form a coalition himself. Though that said, it's highly unlikely that President Rivlin would grant Bennett the mandate over Lapid, Rivlin reportedly believing that giving Yamina the mandate is tantamount to giving Netanyahu a second chance. Now, joining me to discuss the last-minute coalition talks ahead of tonight's midnight deadline, Jeremy Salton, political strategist and director of English operations for the Yamina Party. Jeremy, thank you again for being with us. Now, what happened with Netanyahu and Bennett's negotiations? Why are they falling through?
Well, you can ask Netanyahu. What it comes down to is Bennett's done everything possible in order to try to form the government. We've said time and time again that Netanyahu can count on our 7 fingers when it comes to the race for 61. The problem is the 52 that he entered the president's house with, plus our 7 is 59. That's not enough to get to 61. And it's on the prime minister to try to go ahead and do something about it. He has one option, which is to go ahead and put pressure on Smotrich to allow us to maintain that 59 coalition with perhaps one or two side deals with the Ra'am party when it comes to the confidence motion and the state budget votes. Another option would be to go ahead and to give in to the stuff that Gideon Sa'ar wants to see, which is Netanyahu leaving the prime minister's house and vacating the way so that his voters get something out of it. Whichever way, whether it's going ahead and putting pressure on Smotrich so that Netanyahu can maintain his residency on Balfour, or going to Gideon Sa'ar's direction, which is to maintain a right-wing government with someone else at the head of the Likud, it's on Netanyahu to make the choice before midnight if he wants to go for either of those options. If he does not, then his mandate will expire, and it'll be up to the president to decide what to do going forward.
All right, now we've actually heard some reports coming out of seemingly nowhere alleging that Netanyahu would push the right-wing bloc at the end of his mandate to recommend Energy Minister Yuval Steinitz for the next mandate and usurp Yair Lapid in some way. Do you think that there's a chance of that? And if so, what would that change?
Yeah, look, it's a possibility. There are a lot of scenarios out there. I think Yuval, who happens to be my neighbor here in Mevaseret Zion, is a great guy. I think he would do a great job as prime minister if that's who the Likud would want to go ahead and put forth. And of course, if we do go the route, and I think the president should go that route, we'll see what Rivlin wants to do. But if he goes to consultations, there are two end scenarios. One is that Bennett gets a majority of the nominations. The second is that the Likud does put someone else up, such as Steinitz. A situation like that, I would see would be a lot easier for people like Gideon Sa'ar and perhaps even Yvette Lieberman in the Israel Beitenu party, perhaps even Gantz, to go ahead and rally behind that sort of premiership. And it's possible that's the answer. But we have to see. Tomorrow we'll know a lot better. First of all, if Rivlin even allows us to go ahead and have another round of consultations, it's possible that he will not allow us to do that. I really strongly suggest that he does allow the process to let itself sort of flow and give the people to make those updates in terms of their decisions. I know from what we've seen from both Sa'ar's party and Abbas's party, who were both on the fence and did not nominate anybody, that they will nominate someone when it comes to the next round, if they have a chance to do so. Or, Rivlin can decide to give up the mandate, and then it's about who gets the 61 signatures.
All right. Jeremy Salton, thank you so much for your insights.
Sure, no problem.
Now, meanwhile, as Knesset members are still trying to form a coalition ahead of the deadline, the Knesset itself leading a special memorial session on Monday in honor of the dozens killed on Mount Meron last weekend. Coming out from a national day of mourning on Sunday, Israel's political and legislative leaders holding another special session in the Knesset on Monday over the disastrous and tragic stampede incident that killed 45 people and wounded 150 more at Mount Meron during the Lag BaOmer holiday.
התמונות הנוראות מן האסון במירון פלשו לכל בית, החרידו כל אדם, סדקו כל לב, ואין מנחם. כולנו יחד מבכים את המכה העצומה. 45 עולמות מלאים עבדו לבלי שוב. חובתנו היסודית היא לבדוק כל היבט של אסון מירון. בתום ימי האבל נבחן בצורה סדורה, מעמיקה ואחראית את כלל הנושאים שקשורים בהתכנסות בהר, בהווה ובעבר. את ההגעה, את ההבטחה, את הכניסה, את היציאה, את פריסת הזמן והכוחות, ומעל הכל, את השינויים ההנדסיים הנדרשים באתר, ואת נושא ההפקעה והניהול והאחריות. נפיק את מלוא הלקחים לעתיד, כדי שהאסון כזה לא יחזור על עצמו.
Though while Netanyahu's statements echoing calls from across the country for an official state inquiry into the incident, only Comptroller Netanyahu Engelman announced the beginnings of a special probe. All other calls for a state-run inquiry commission, including those made by police officials, have so far not materialized, and Public Security Minister Amir Ohana is reportedly behind the stall. having allegedly asked both Police Commissioner Kobi Shabtai and Northern District Police Commander Shimon Lavi to drop their requests behind closed doors. In any case, a state inquiry isn't necessarily needed to know that authorities both planning the events and managing the site were fully warned of the potential for tragedy. And I'm not talking about the state's findings in previous yearly reports, which also detail the risks at Mount Meron. Rather, organizers of this year's deadly Mount Meron festival appear to have ignored a major safety report issued just 8 days before the event. The National Fire and Rescue Services report, necessitated before any large event, has been acquired by Israeli News, and it details all of the dangers associated with the large crowds and poor infrastructure at Meron, while outlining dozens of steps that needed to have been taken to fix the problems. And among the steps, the report specifically demands that 2 separate paths be prepared to regulate foot traffic around the Toldos Acharon compound on the mountain where the stampede occurred. In fact, the 4-page report even goes on to say that if the population exceeds 9,000, then 4 passageways in and out of the compound would be needed. Yet during last week's incident, and despite organizers' promises, just the one dangerous, slippery, and boxed-in passageway was available to the over 20,000 revelers at the site.
In other news, Israel publishing some disconcerting results as new foreign variants of the coronavirus threaten to upset Israel's landmark pandemic exit. Hannah Rivkin reporting.
Just 13 cases of COVID were diagnosed in Israel on Saturday, the lowest daily rate in over 14 months. And the percentages of infections against tests holding at roughly 0.1% into Sunday and Monday. Israel planning to celebrate the continuing reductions by canceling even more virus restrictions. What's more, the U.S. FDA is expected to approve vaccinating children aged 12 through 15 with the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine as soon as next week, and Israeli health authorities already gearing up to roll out the vaccine campaign for these age groups the moment authorization is given. But not all is well in the Holy Land with respect to the still raging pandemic. The health ministry identifying on Monday the first Israeli cases of 2 new COVID strains, originally found in Brazil and in Chile. Both the Brazilian and Chilean variants entering the country via Israelis returning from abroad. And this on top of the some 60 cases of the Indian variant that had been identified in Israel by Sunday. So with this in mind, Israelis are now banned for the time being, and with few exceptions, from traveling to 7 nations where the outbreaks are particularly severe. The nations including Ukraine, Ethiopia, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, Turkey, and India. Then finally, with respect to India specifically, Israel making good on promises to help. Over half of all the current COVID infections on Earth falling between India and Brazil, with India in particular dire straits as over 20 million citizens now infected. So along with the US, UK, and select other states, Israel approving of a series of flights throughout the week, set to carry thousands of groups of individual oxygen generators, respirators, medications, and other medical equipment, Prime Minister Netanyahu having promised as much last month.
Now, the latest letdown in the Palestinian Authority, PA President Mahmoud Abbas having just canceled the first Palestinian elections in nearly 15 years, and he's blaming Israel for his decision. But of course, there's more to the story than meets the eye. So here now with more on the canceled 2021 Palestinian elections, author and award-winning columnist for both J-Post and Al-Quds newspaper, Dr. Gershon Baskin. Thank you so much for being with us. Now let's start with the most basic question. Why is the election being delayed? Abbas is blaming Israel and voting restrictions in Jerusalem, but it's largely suspected that actually Hamas would win, and it's for this reason that Abbas canceled the vote.
I think it's a varied group of reasons that you've named, and they're all true. There's certainly fear that Hamas would perhaps have a better position in the outcome of the elections. I don't think anyone is projecting a Hamas victory. There are 31 lists that were registered to run in the elections, and there are at least 3 lists that are identified with the Fatah movement that Mahmoud Abbas heads. So I think that the fear was that their list would be split and they would get fewer seats. And other lists would get seats, and Hamas has a unified list, so they would get more seats. This is definitely a fear. The issue of Jerusalem is also central to the issue, although I think they could find ways of getting around it, allowing people to vote by mail, voting online, or voting in stations beyond the Israeli separation barrier. But Jerusalem is a central issue to the Palestinians, and once Israel refused to allow, or actually didn't even give an answer of whether or not Israel would allow voting to take place in Jerusalem, it was a convenient excuse for Abbas to cancel them.
All right, now, I read in a recent column of yours, actually, that you think Palestinian Authority President Abbas has overstayed his welcome. Do you still think that way, and who do you think should replace him?
Well, he's in the 14th or 15th year of a four-year term, and I think the majority of Palestinians feel that he should step down. He's old, and he has monopolized Palestinian politics for a long time. It's important to remember that these elections that were just postponed were not for the position of president. Those elections are still scheduled to take place in July. Who should take over is a matter of choice for the Palestinian people. I think they need to have the right to have a democratic vote to decide who their leadership should be, and they should live with the consequences of those decisions. It's not for me as an Israeli to decide who the Palestinian leader should be.
So who do you think would have the best chance at coming out on top in the PA parliament?
It's very clear from Palestinian public opinion polls that the list supported by imprisoned Marwan Barghouti would have the best chance of replacing the Fatah list headed by Abbas. And when and if presidential elections take place, Marwan Barghouti from Israeli prison is the most likely outcome winner of those elections.
Would that be a functional government?
It wouldn't be a functional government, but it would be symbolic, and pressure would be applied on Israel to release Marwan Barghouti, which is exactly the point of why he's probably running after being in prison since 2002 for leading the Second Intifada.
All right. Well, thank you very much for shedding some light on this, Gershon Baskin. Moving on now to something moving. Israel's first ever transgender premier soccer referee taking to the field for the first time since coming out publicly as a woman earlier last week. In a league first for Israel, 26-year-old soccer referee Sapir Berman taking to the pitch Monday evening for the latest match between Israeli teams Hapoel Haifa and Beitar Jerusalem. But why is this a historic first for Israel? Well, because this is Berman's first time presiding over a match as a woman, making her the country's first ever trans soccer referee. Having served as a ref in the Premier League for years already, Sapir came out publicly as a trans woman in late April, explaining that she'd been struggling with her gender identity for years. And this was her first day on the job in her new shoes, or cleats.
תמיד ראיתי את עצמי בתור אישה. זה מגיל מאוד צעיר. בתחילת דרכי לא ידעתי לתת לזה שם, לא ידעתי איך לקרוא לזה. אבל תמיד הייתה איזושהי משיכה לצד הנשי, והייתה סוג של קנאה למין הנשי, וחייתי עם זה לצד דמות מאוד גברית. וראיתי גבר מצליח, אם זה באיגוד השופטים, ואם זה בלימודים, ואם זה עם בנות, אבל כשהייתי לבד, אני הייתי אישה. וחילקתי את העולמות האלה, כי הבנתי שהחברה לא תקבל אותי.
While it's true that Sapir's transition may not be accepted by all, though, most reactions have been positive. Berman seen chatting and laughing casually with players before the kickoff.
ישנם גם שחקנים שפונים אליי בלשון נקבה כבר, שהם ממש מרגישים שהם רוצים לקחת איפשהו מקום בתהליך הזה, ואפילו פונים אליי שאין צורך לפנות אליי, ופונים אליי בלשון אישה. אז תודה לכם.
And it's not just the other staff, the league, administrators, and athletes. Off the field, too, fans are expressing their full acceptance of Sapir's new identity, if not outright full support. And by the way, Haifa beat Jerusalem on Monday night's match 3-1. Now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Chana Rivkin.
Good evening, Aaron. Thank you. Now, lows this evening in the upper teens in the northern and central regions and the 20s in the southern region. Then temperature highs tomorrow will get up to the upper 20s or lower 30s depending on the area. Partly cloudy skies continuing into Wednesday. Back to the studio now.
Thank you, Chana. Now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. These kittens were actually born in a factory in Ashdod, and they've taken a liking to one of the workers. Follow him everywhere, and I wish I had that same thing. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.26 shekels to the American dollar and 2.64 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.